This presentation, titled Auditing Skills Beyond ISO 19011, Audit, a Mental Judo, comes to us from Rai Chowdhary. Rai has served in various roles across multiple industries, starting his first assignment as project engineer with Westex Systems, Inc. on a NASA project to make silicon crystals on board the space shuttle during the 1980s. As an engineer, he invented new technologies for making solar cells, medical devices, and lead-free non-toxic radiation shielding products. As a business leader, he led the implementation of initiatives at Fortune 500 companies to deliver top quartile performance. In his current role as CEO of the KPI system, Rai is focused on adding value to small, medium, and large organizations through continual improvement, audits, and building robust supply chains. He is certified as a Six Sigma Black Belt, quality engineer, quality manager, and Exemplar Global Auditor for Quality Management Systems, as well as ISO 13485. And with that, take it away, Rai.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Exemplar Global, for the opportunity to present this session on audit. Is it a mental judo? Here is a little bit about myself. I came to the US in 1981, went to Arizona State to earn my master's in material science. Since then, I've been in business and industry as more than 30 years, earned my Six Sigma Black Belt, got my auditor certification, worked in large and small companies as well, and here I am today presenting this to you. I appreciate you all joining me. So let's begin on what is it that ISO 19011 talks about and what underlies all of that. We will also talk about the parties involved in the audit. We will take a look at the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are identified in 19011, which are listed as the competencies. But more importantly, we will take a look at what underlies those, what is behind those knowledge, skills, and abilities. Why do some audits not work out the way they were supposed to? See, what happens is, anytime you have an audit, there are three parties involved in the audit at minimum. One is the auditor, the other is the auditee. Now, the auditor and the auditee may be an individual person, or it could be a team. There could be an audit team, there could be a team on the side of the auditee as well. So it is not just two people, it is more than two people involved. Then we also have the audit client. In some cases, the audit client may be the same as the auditee. But let's leave that aside for a minute. Let's focus on the human element. Why? Because none of these three entities are robots. Each of them has the human element present in it. Now, what happens when the human element comes into the picture? The moment you have a human element into the picture, there are going to be several other factors which also come into play. Factors such as hierarchy. We may try to keep hierarchy away, but that is not possible. The very title auditor and auditee sets off a mental process which makes one think that one is at a higher level than the other. This hierarchy sometimes is real, sometimes it is just perceived. But regardless, that hierarchy is going to be present. All of these things that I'm talking about, they have an impact on how the audit will proceed and whether the audit objectives will be achieved or not. So besides hierarchies, there are interactions. You got the human element. How can interactions not be there? Interactions are necessary to get the audit done. Then we have feelings. We have subjectivity. We have concerns. We have emotions. All those are an inherent part of us being a human. And all of those kind of become a kind of a soup that materializes as the audit proceeds. So as you can see, the human element has a big role to play in the audit. Audits can go very well. In some cases, they can go downhill. Now, granted that not every audit is going to go downhill, but the ones which go downhill are the ones which create the biggest problem for the auditee and the auditor. It's a no-win situation. My intent is not to point blame, not to say that the auditor is to blame or the auditee is to blame. That is of no use. But we need to understand how we can harness the competencies and what does the auditor have to do to turn the situation around so that it does not become a mental judo. We don't want it to be combative. We don't want it to be a win-lose. We want audits to be win-win, benefit to both parties. So why do audits go downhill? Well, let me go back to hierarchy for a second. The moment there is a mindset that there is a hierarchy, there is a certain element of apprehension and fear that starts coming in. Any organization, whether it is the auditor's organization or the auditee's organization, any organization will have the 6 M's, man, material, machine, so on, the 6 M's that we all know, and the 1 C in operation. What is that 1 C? That 1 C is called culture. So every organization has its own set of 6 M's and 1 C. Why is that important? That is important because if one of the M's is machine and the auditor or the auditee does not know how to use the equipment right, then the audit doesn't work out very well. If the methods, which is another of these M's, if the methods are not properly followed, again, that can have a bearing on the audit. And it doesn't matter whether that is happening on the side of the auditor or the auditee. Even more important, if the culture is not right in the auditee's organization or in the auditor's organization, that can create a very big problem. What do I mean by that? When I talk about culture not being right, if an organization is being run by command and control, if an organization is being run on the basis of fear, do this or else, if punishment is meted out when people make mistakes, that creates a lot of fear. It doesn't matter whether it is the auditor or the auditee. And that fear psychosis sets off a chain reaction. Further, if the auditor's organization has the culture that you, the auditor, have not earned your keep unless you have found major non-conformances, that becomes a big problem because now the auditor is predisposed to just finding stuff. You think that doesn't happen? Think again. Anyway, so the 6 M's and 1 C have a huge impact on what will be the slope during the audit. And the greater the slope, the greater becomes the problem. So the objective of the auditor is to investigate, examine, and find out whether the requirements of the standard, and when I say the standard, I mean 9001 or 13485 or whatever that certification standard is, whether the requirements of that standard are being met by the auditee or not. And whether there is a major non-conformance, minor non-conformance, or in some cases, people may just list it as a non-conformance. So that is what the auditor is trying to do, should be doing, honestly speaking. What is happening at the auditee's side? There is hierarchy operating. There is that fear. If I don't pass this audit, my job may be at risk, my reputation may be at risk. So those factors are beginning to come into play. And the more deficient the organization, the higher will be the fear, or at least the perceived deficiency. The higher the perceived deficiency, the higher the fear will be in the mind of the auditee. Those factors trigger a downward slope. If the auditee perceives a problem coming and the culture in the organization is that of fear, what happens is that instinct-driven behaviors will result in the auditee trying to dodge or be evasive in nature. The auditee may not even realize that that is beginning to happen. What does the auditor look at? The auditor says, I need this information. I need to verify and find out whether there is a conformance or a non-conformance. I'm not getting that. So the auditor tries to dig deeper. It is natural because that is what the auditor is supposed to do. They have to verify whether the standards requirements are being met or not. So the auditor tries to dig deeper, and that creates more fear. At some point, there will be a near panic situation. And once that near panic situation or the panic situation sets in place, the whole concept of objectivity of the audit is completely lost. There is a concept called amygdala hijack. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Once the amygdala hijack is in place, all rational thought and logic goes out the window. At that point, emotions have completely taken charge. I have seen people break down during audits, break down to the point that we could not continue the audit. Now, granted, that is an extreme, but some people will not show that breakdown on the outside. They are breaking down on the inside, but they are not going to show. Some people will do that. Regardless, the benefit of the audit, the purpose of the audit is compromised. Nobody wins at that point. What is the result of all this? Where does this lead to? This leads to apprehension. This leads to uneasiness. This leads to disturbances both for the auditor and the auditee and the process of the audit. This creates intimidation for the most part in the mind of the auditee. Further, it raises the tension. And finally, it feels like a very, very bad sting. And that sting can be felt both by the auditor and the auditee. Nobody wins. We don't want to go there. ISO 19011 talks about the competencies of an auditor, and I'll share those competencies with you. There are about 25 plus competencies that are listed. But the bottom line is, this is not what we want to see happen. Now, what happens once the emotions have gone sky high? Fear is in the picture, and even if the evidence is there, because fear is coloring the inputs we are getting, the evidence gets distorted and obscured. The evidence is there that there is a procedure to do a certain piece of work or task. So there is a procedure, but the auditor may feel the procedure is not clear. On the other hand, the auditee may feel that the procedure is clear enough based on the qualifications and training given to the individual. This type of a distortion, I gave you a very simple example, there are many more. This type of a distortion can start ballooning. And the result is either unnecessary non-conformances can be written, or where a non-conformance should be written, it won't get written. So that is what we have to keep in mind. Now, as I mentioned, 19011 talks about the competencies required for an auditor and also for the other people in the audit. Here is a list of that, and I'll pick up on 4 just to illustrate my point. The first one I will talk about is the ability to use suitable technology when conducting remote audits. Remember the 6 M's? One of the M's was machine. This is related to that. The ability to use technology should be there on the part of the auditor and the auditee. Let me pick up on another one. Planning, then there is risk-based approach, and then there is systematic approach to conducting the audit. I would be delighted to talk about all 25 plus of them, but given the limitations of time, I'll just stick to these 4. So planning, risk-based approach, and systematic approach. What do those require? Those require a very clear thinking process. Those require an unagitated mind so that a person can clearly lay out what needs to be done when, during the audit, how the questions need to be asked, what are the questions that need to be asked, how are we going to look at the evidence, how are we going to prioritize based on risk. If the mind is completely in a disturbed state and emotion has taken over, none of those 3, the planning, the risk-based approach, and the systematic approach, are going to work out well. All of that emotion is going to create a big mess as we try to make that approach work. Which M does that belong to? That belongs to the methods used to conduct the audit. And what is the other factor underlying all of that? It is the 1C that I talked about earlier, the culture. So there is a lot that follows because of the 6 M's and 1C from each of the parties in the audit. The bottom line in all of this is that the impact of emotions is real. We cannot afford to ignore that. More importantly, both the auditor and the auditee, and of course the audit client, all these parties need to keep in mind that we need to keep our emotions in check. But to keep emotions in check, what are the markers that will tell us that something is not working right? So we will talk about that in a few minutes. Again, the bottom line is we need to manage our emotions during the audit, and actually that preparation work starts far ahead of the audit. Now, who has the ball in their court? Is it the auditee or the auditor? Well, they both do. But once an audit starts, in my opinion, the bigger responsibility is on the shoulders of the auditor, because they are the ones who are eventually going to write the non-conformances. They are the ones who are going to be perceived as a person in power, and therefore the ball is in the court of the auditor once the audit starts. And the auditor needs to be aware of that. So what are some tips? What are some indications that the audit is not working out right and that we need to do something different? How are we going to recognize that? To be able to do that, I will have to give you a little bit of background on the human brain. The brain is a very complex organ. It is said, or one model of the brain says that we have 3 brains. Okay, one is the reptilian brain, the other is the limbic brain, and the third is the neocortex. The reptilian brain primarily is responsible for high emotion, instinctive behavior, pre-programmed behaviors, behaviors that are triggered without thinking. What are those types of behaviors? It is fight, flight, fright, and then there are some others which we don't need to get into. But these 3 are the ones that impact the audit. That is what the reptilian brain does. So there is a stimulus, and the stimulus can be a question from the auditor, or that stimulus can be the way an auditor interviews someone. So that becomes the stimulus, and there is a response. The response comes from the auditee. And keep in mind, the reptilian brain is constantly in operation. The reptilian brain's job is to save us from trouble. I have had audits where I was looking at the auditee, I was asking them questions, and one of their team members, unknown to me, was behind my back, prompting them what answers to give. If that is not reptilian behavior, what is it? And this poor girl, instead of looking at me, she was looking over my head, looking at the person behind me. I didn't know why she was looking over my head until later I turned around to see what was going on. And this guy who was behind me was beginning to walk away from behind me because he saw me trying to turn around to see what was going on. Once he was gone, whatever questions I was asking this lady, they were just going haywire. She was not able to answer much of what I was asking her. I was not trying to intimidate anyone. It was a very calm and a very patient process that I was using, and there was no pointing fingers. And yet, that fear came into the picture. Reptilian brain, limbic brain, and the neocortex or the prefrontal cortex. What does the limbic brain do? The limbic brain is the center of emotion and passion. It doesn't it works somewhat automated, but the reptilian brain always works on an automatic mode. Thinking, planning, reasoning, all of those faculties happen in the neocortex. The reptilian brain will short circuit everything and do things and trigger behaviors. But when we are consciously processing information, it is the neocortex and the prefrontal cortex which are in operation at that point. Why is this important? The effort from the auditor should be to enable a person to work primarily using the neocortex. And that is why I said earlier that the ball is in the auditor's court once the audit starts. The behavior of the auditor and the auditee depends on a lot of elements, lot of factors. What are those? The behavior during the audit is a function of thoughts, feelings, personality, physiology, circumstances, genetics, social factors, many of those. And a lot of those put together, they manifest as the culture of the organization. They manifest itself as the individual and their behaviors and their thought processes, their attitudes. All of those are a bundle. It's not the objective in this session to peel out that bundle and look at each of them. We don't have the time to do that, but we need to remember that all of this is operating in the background. So what can the auditor do? The auditor can make sure that they recognize when the audit is going downhill. Once that is detected in the behaviors, fear, fight, fright, those types of behaviors, when you start seeing that happen, it's time to hit the pause button. Let things calm down, regroup, and start the audit in a different tone. Break the ice, make everybody comfortable, bring them back to a neutral state as much as possible. Restart the audit while making sure that the reptilian brain doesn't get excited again and trigger automatic behaviors. Ask the questions in a very polite manner. Use the word may I. Can you please? Those are good words to use in an audit, and yet many times they are not used. Could you please? The standard requires you to have a documented process for XYZ. Can I please see that? Very simple. And yet many times it is not done that way. The reptilian brain is with us. It will stay with us. So we need to be aware on how to deal with it and move people out of that kind of a trigger mode into more of an executive function where they can respond by thinking through. Your procedure says that the operator needs to do this and this and this, that the data entry clerk needs to do this first and this first and this first. Can we please go check and see whether that is really happening? Can we verify that? Is it possible to speak to your data entry clerk? Not difficult to do. And yet, many times that doesn't happen. At the end of the day, there are sources of evidence, then there are types of evidence, and the interactions that happen in that whole process. The sources of evidence can be management reviews, they can be operation of the equipment, a look at the operation of the equipment, they can be an examination of product files, they can be an examination of how processes are being run, they can be an inspection of how the facilities are being maintained. So those are the sources of evidence. And what are the types of evidence? The types of evidence are documents, they are records, they are direct observation, they are statements from the auditee. So those are the types of evidence. And the auditor actually is trying to look at the standards, say, here are the requirements, here are the sources from which I can go find the evidence, and I need to look at whether the evidence is matching what the standard says. Are they matching or not matching? What happens once the emotions are aroused? Or once we start finding out that the results are not meeting requirements. See, as long as the results and the evidence are better than or meet requirements, there is no problem. The trouble starts to come in, the fear factor and the emotion starts to come in when there is a gap. When the evidence and the results don't match up to what the requirements are asking for. And the bigger the gap, the more the emotion is likely to set in. The auditor can watch this, keep that in mind, and make sure that the reptilian brain type behaviors don't get triggered. And what that means is the auditor needs to present the information carefully and be mindful of what might happen to the audience. If the auditor already knows that the culture in the organization is that of command and control and fear and punishment, this becomes even more important. But many times the auditor may not know enough about that. The point I'm trying to make is very simple. How the auditor presents information about the non-conformance makes a big difference. Finally, at the end of the audit, a report will be generated. The tonality of the report needs to be watched carefully as well. If the report is written in an accusatory tone, in a derogatory tone, that is going to become a disincentive. It will not look good for the auditor, it will not look good for the auditee as well. Stating the facts is all we need to do. There is a fine line between assertiveness and arrogance. And that fine line depends on the individual. That fine line will be different for me as it is different for you. Nevertheless, mindfulness on the part of the auditor, not only during the audit, but also after the audit, as they are writing the report, that mindfulness has to prevail. So the report needs to be written in a neutral language, without accusatory tones, and without pointing fingers. Why? Because we want to use the audit as a lever for improvement, not as a hammer. As you can see, there are lots of different inputs that come into the audit, and there are lots of outputs that come out of the audit process. And eventually, all of that culminates in a report. And these become the report and the recommendations, especially in a first and second party audit. We will see recommendations being discussed or opportunities for improvement being discussed. In a third party audit, that's a different matter. But in first and second party audits, those things are there in the report. How they are presented is very important. Finally, we have the audit conclusion. In many cases, I am certifying a supplier to be fit for use for a particular client of mine. So in the conclusion, I have to write whether this supplier meets the requirements of the standard and also the requirements of my client, and whether they are fit to be on the approved supplier list or not. So audit conclusions, the way they are written, if they are not fit for use, if they are not suitable to be on the ASL, it needs to be worded properly, because eventually that report is going to go not just to my client, but also to the auditee. Anyway, the audit outcomes can work as a lever or as a hammer. The intent is not to coerce or push the organization and be negative. That's not really the intent of the audit. The intent of the audit is to create a win-win for everyone, so that the organization can move forward with employee engagement, not with disengagement. And it delivers positive results for everyone. That is what we want to accomplish. So let me introduce another idea for you. We have seen that fear is going to trigger evasive and dodging behaviors. Fear is going to, emotion and fear together are likely to derail an audit completely. And I mentioned to you earlier that the auditor needs to be watchful, mindful of the behaviors on the part of the auditee. Actually, it can go the other way around also. Sometimes the auditor can have a panic attack, but that is not as frequent. Most of the time, it is on the part of the auditee. The new point I'm trying to introduce to you is very interesting. Thousands of years ago, the sages of the East recognized human behavior and categorized it into 3 different categories. These categories apply to just about everything you will see. Human behavior, mindsets, objects that you come across, processes, methods, it applies to everything. But I'll focus on human behavior for right now. These 3 categories are sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic. Tamasic directly map into the reptilian brain's behaviors: fear, flight, fright, trying to run away, escape. All of those are examples of tamasic behavior: telling lies, evasing, dodging, all of those. Rajasic behaviors are when a person speaks a lot more during the audit and offers a lot more information than what was asked for. They are trying to overwhelm the auditor by their knowledge or by their ability. That's an example of rajasic behavior. Is it good? Is it bad? I'll keep that aside. And sattvic behavior is where they are able to work with the auditor, fully aware that the auditor is only trying to look at whether the standards requirements are being met or not. They are able to cooperate. Questions are being answered in the appropriate manner, with diligence, with thought, and the right evidence is chosen to present to the auditor. And the auditor interprets that evidence in the proper way. If the evidence is lacking, the auditee can explain without hesitation in a peaceful and calm manner that this is how the evidence fits with the requirements of the standard. Going back to the example I was talking about, auditor sees a procedure or a work instruction and says that this is inadequate. The auditee says, no, this is adequate based on the technical capability of our staff. It is only highly qualified master's degree or PhD degree holders who are going to be running this process. So the procedure doesn't have to give all the minute details that would be required if a high school person was running the process. then the auditor may say, okay, I can understand that. Show me where you say that this procedure will be run by people with this kind of a qualification. So then they are able to produce the evidence showing that only qualified people can run that SOP. And here is the list of qualifications that is needed. And if the auditor wants to dig deeper, then the auditee is able to bring in those people or take the auditor to those persons who are actually running the process. And all of that verification can be done. It needs to be done. And it can be done in a very level-headed, peaceful, and calm atmosphere, instead of getting agitated and getting emotionally wound up. Isn't it interesting that thousands of years ago, the sages saw different behaviors and categorized them? So the tamasic maps into the reptilian brain, the rajasic maps into the limbic brain, and the sattvic maps into the neocortex. Who would have thought of that? If we are able to conduct audits by keeping the reptilian brain in check and operate mostly in the neocortex operational mode, we can take our audits from concern and fear to contagious courage. 19,011 did a great job of identifying more than 25 areas of competency. But what is it required? What is it required that will enable us to make those competencies work well? Let's summarize real quick. We need to remember that 6 M's and 1 C are present in every organization. Auditor, auditee, audit client, doesn't matter. They are there. We need to remember that mindfulness is important on the parts of both the auditor and the auditee. Once the audit kicks off, the ball, for the most part, is in the auditor's court. That's my opinion, based on all the experience I have from dozens and dozens and dozens of audits I have done. Finally, we need to realize that we have the 3-brain model that is operating all the time. And we need to make sure that interactions and all of the factors that are in this soup called the audit do not take us into reptilian behavior, not on the part of the auditor, neither on the part of the auditee. So this understanding is important for both parties. I hope you enjoyed my session. I hope you got some good information out of this. If you would like to discuss more or connect with me, here is my contact information. I'm based in the US in Salt Lake City at this time. For the most part, I live in the US, but I do travel as well. The phone number still stays the same. Thank you for your time, and you have a good day.
Well, thank you, Rai Chowdhary, for that perspective on auditing skills beyond ISO 19011. And that concludes this presentation.